This is the Storytrails podcast. Listen in as we explore India through her stories. Every side has a story to tell. 13 stories high, 65 meters tall, it has big in its name and it towers over all. Made of hard granite, not steel nor gold, a marvel of engineering 1000 years old. That's the monument we'll be talking about today.
Today, we'll be talking about a temple that's more than 1,000 years old. Millions of devotees have worshipped here during its life. For centuries, they came and admired this massive structure, strangely, without even knowing its real name, or when and how it was built, or even who built it. They'd probably assumed that it was so old that it would be impossible to dig out answers. But in 1887, someone did feel very curious about this grand temple and started asking questions. And he managed to find answers to this centuries old puzzle. His name was Dr. Eugen Hulsch. That is Hulsch with a ZSCH in the end. Hulsch. He was the chief epigraphist of the Archaeological Survey of India. He was a German who had fallen in love with India and devoted his life to decoding ancient Indian inscriptions. Hulsh was supported by a brilliant assistant named Valayathur Venkaya. Now, Venkaya had studied classical languages, but he was keen on pursuing a career in physics. It was Hulsh who persuaded him to take up archaeology instead. Venkaya brought in a wealth of contextual knowledge to this research. Moreover, he belonged to the priestly class and had access to the innermost parts of the temple, which were out of bounds to Hulsh. So Venkaya would copy down all the inscriptions he saw inside, and together the pair would interpret them. They made a formidable team. And it was their efforts that helped us to rediscover one of the grandest structures built in ancient South India, the mighty Brihadeeswara temple in Thanjavur, Tamil Nadu. There are ancient inscriptions all over this temple, verses written in an old Tamil script. They are so striking that no visitor can miss this writing on the walls. Yet, for centuries, devotees overlooked them simply because no one knew what they said. For Hulsh and Venkaya, this was a treasure trove. They deciphered these inscriptions and came up with some amazing findings. They discovered that this was a 1,000-year-old temple built way back in 1010 CE. They discovered that the original name of this temple was not Brihadishwara but Rajarajeshwaram. The Brihadishwara name became popular only fairly recently, since the late 17th century when the Marathas ruled over these parts. Most people, however, know this temple as Periya Kovil or Big Temple simply because it was huge. But why was it named Rajarajeshwaram originally? It was Hulsh and Venkaya who discovered that this temple was built by a great Chola king named Arulmozhivarman. You may recognize him by his more popular title, Rajaraja the First.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Story Trails podcast, exploring India through her stories. In today's episode, we'll take you through the Brihadishwara temple in Thanjavur, more popularly known as the Big Temple. My name is Vijay Prabhat Kamalakara, and I have my Story Trails colleagues with me, Akila and Kaushik.
Hi everyone.
Hello.
That was a very interesting story, Akila. You know, in Sanskrit, Brihad literally means big or mighty. And everything about the Brihadishwara temple is big, isn't it? Did you know that the Vimanam, which is the tower over the main sanctum, is a staggering 63 meters tall?
Hmm.
So, when it was built first over 1,000 years ago, it seems it was the tallest man made structure in the world, except the pyramids.
Yeah, that's true. The other amazing thing is that it took over 130,000 tons of granite to build this tower. Interestingly, the nearest granite quarry is 50 kilometers from this temple. Just
Hmm.
imagine, they had to mine, transport, and carve this into a beautiful temple.
Tough job, huh?
And Yeah, and the best part is that Rajaraja's craftsmen did all this in just 7 years. That is a finishing rate of 50 tons a day with no machinery or heavy lifting equipment.
Hmm.
What I find most amazing is that over the last 1,000 years, this temple has withstood six earthquakes, one
Hmm.
major fire, and several violent storms. You know, truly, this temple is an amazing architectural marvel, even by modern day standards.
Right. But how did it survive all that and still retain its beauty? To discuss all this and more, we have with us today a very special guest. I'm delighted to welcome Madhusudhanan Kalaiselvan. Madhusudhanan is an architect, a gold medalist, who specializes in conservation and architectural research. He's an active heritage enthusiast who serves on government panels for conservation of temples in Tamil Nadu. His areas of expertise include art, architecture, heritage, religion, and culture studies, and he is a popular speaker on all these topics. He is a recipient of the coveted Vedavalli Memorial Award for outstanding service by a young achiever in these fields. He is also a recipient of the title Ilakkiya Chammal that recognizes his mastery over Tamil literature. Madhu curates and conducts tours to places of architectural and cultural interest. Thanks for joining us today on this podcast, Madhu.
Yeah, my pleasure it is.
Today, we'd like to talk to you about the engineering marvel that the temple is. We are going to talk about the many myths that are associated with this temple, and we'll also talk about the man who built the temple. But let's start with the most basic of all questions. Now, we've all heard of the Brihadeeswara temple. We all know that it is an important monument. But for a layperson, why is this a significant monument? Or what is the big deal about the big temple?
Okay. To begin with, it's a temple. It's a living temple, and a temple that was built a good 1,000 years back. We've had temples that were built even before that, much before that actually. And some of them are still living temples too. But to add on to the speciality tag that this takes, I think for a layman it is more the magnitude, the scale, the mammoth size of it that matters. And considering the volume of magnificence, the work that it would have demanded, the labor that it would have demanded a good 1,000 years back certainly makes it a very, very unique and a special monument for anybody.
So, it is undoubtedly a grand and very large and massive monument. Tell us a little more about the man who built this monument. What makes him an interesting historical character?
Okay, so we all know that it was Rajaraja the Great who patronized the construction of this monument, and he was certainly assisted by what seemed to be the most efficient uh, team of architects and the starting from the stonemasons and just everybody. Rajaraja is generally addressed as Rajaraja the Great, or as the name goes, King of all kings, because yes, he was in all true sense King of all kings, because he was very, very strategic, seems to have been extremely benevolent, going by the way the conduct of the governance was, and the way people reacted to laws being framed, and the way the show was happening then. Seems like he was a very, very strategic and a benevolent king, and a pious and a devout person too. And he seems to have also patronized almost all religions that were popular then.
Mhm.
And More importantly, his military expeditions have been very, very planned, and almost all of them seem to have been successful. So what more
Hmm.
do you want from a king, a leader that way?
Right.
So he seems to be a very, very special and the most popular king of the Chola dynasty, which had dozens of others before and after him.
Just to add to that, when Rajaraja ascended the throne, this was in 985 CE, the Chola kingdom was basically a kind of a largish chunk of territory somewhere in central Tamil Nadu, not more than that. But by the early years of Rajaraja's reign, he'd already subjugated the Pandyas and the Cheras, which meant that the
Hmm.
whole of Tamil Nadu and Kerala were now Chola territory. After that, he defeated the eastern Chalukyas and the Vengi kingdom, which brought the entire southern peninsula. So, in modern day terms, that would be Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Andhra, and southern Karnataka all under the Chola belt.
Hmm.
Then his navy just went across the seas and conquered the northern half of Sri Lanka and the Maldives.
Yeah, that's right. Ultimately, his son Rajendra Chola completed the conquest of southern Sri Lanka too. So the entire Sri Lanka came under him.
Right. But leading on from there, now we know that the Brihadeeswara temple we see today is not the work of one person or not even one dynasty. There are marks that many subsequent dynasties have left on the temple. But just to give our listeners a very quick timeline of the temple, which are the dynasties that have ruled over these parts over the last 1000 years since the temple was constructed?
There have been quite a few of those dynasties over here, Vijay. So,
Mhm.
as I mentioned earlier, the Cholas became powerful under Rajaraja when he defeated the Pandyas.
Hmm.
But they were not going to stay defeated forever, isn't it? So, by the 13th century, the Pandyas struck back. They fought the
Mhm.
Cholas and completely overran the Chola kingdom. During their brief rule, the Pandyas too patronized this temple. And
Mhm.
then, by the early 14th century, the Pandyas themselves fell to the Delhi Sultanate. For the next 50 years, there were Islamic kings from Delhi and the Malabar sultans ruling over Thanjavur. Not much
Mhm.
happened at the temple during this period. Then, by the late 14th century, the Vijayanagara Empire took over Thanjavur and they ruled for more than 150 years. You
Hmm.
must remember the Vijayanagara Empire was huge. So, what they did was they appointed viceroys called Nayaks to rule over
Right.
the Thanjavur belt. But by the mid 16th century, when the Vijayanagara Empire itself weakened, all these Nayaks they declared themselves independent rulers, and Tanjavur got itself a brand new Nayak ruler.
Mhm.
Both the Vijayanagara and the Nayak rulers, both of them were very generous patrons to this temple. After them came the Marathas, who defeated the Nayaks in the late 17th century. They ruled for nearly 200 years until the mid 19th century. The
Hmm.
Marathas too were great patrons of this temple. Finally, in 1855, the British took over.
You
Mhm.
know, even today, one of the trustees in a temple management committee is a direct descendant of the Maratha kings.
Yes, he is there.
Interesting. So the Cholas, Pandyas, Nayaks, and the Marathas, they all patronized this temple. But if you were to walk through the temple today, what are the most visible marks that these different dynasties have left behind?
Well, as soon as you enter, you park your car in the opposite parking lot and you cross the road to enter. There is this first arch, a grand arch with what we call technically as a battlement parapet. Those really wide walls kind of encloses the fort campus. All
Mhm.
of those are additions from the Maratha period. That's almost the latest addition done to the temple. You cross that first arch and then you stand in front of what seems to be a very, very grand Gopuram for the times that it was built, a double walled Gopuram, which is called as Keralantakan Gopuram. That is the first title that Rajaraja earned after his successful military expedition over the Chera kingdom, the Kerala kings then. So
Right.
that probably was a very befitting name to that Gopuram, that being the first title earned by Rajaraja. So that is a very, very unique structure all by itself. The next Gopuram is, of course, the most popular Rajarajan Gopuram. That houses the very iconic Dwarapalakas, the monolith, huge ones, close to 10, 12 feet tall Dwarapalakas, the door guardians on either sides. Very, very dramatic features they are uh, carved out with. That's the second Gopuram. The Nataraja shrine, which will be to your right as soon as you enter, the structure, the shrine as such is from the Maratha period, while the
Hmm.
Murti enshrined inside, the bronze icon of Nataraja, is a classic imperial Chola production done during Rajaraja's time. The Nandi, the very massive and popular Nandi there, was installed during Chevapanayaka's time. The original Nandi that Rajaraja gave is there in the south corridor. The
Hmm.
main entrance archway is again a Maratha intrusion. The Mahamandapa, the Ardha Mandapa, and all the other mandapas, till the Garbhagraham and the grand Vimanam on top, is all from Rajaraja's time. The very beautifully chiseled and planned, very, very artistic shrine of Muruga is from the Nayaka period again. Ganesha's shrine that is in worship today is from Maratha's time. Ambal shrine, the Devi shrine, very just next to Nandi Mandapam, is from the Pandya period. So the grand Chola edifice was probably bejeweled with all these little additions over the next roughly 800, 900 years, and you have the complete jewel that it is.
It is amazing, isn't it? How so many different styles from so many different time periods have come together to make such a grand monument.
That
Certainly.
it is amazing.
Now, I have to ask you about some of the many myths surrounding this temple. There is a popular myth that for a long time, the idol of Nandi in this temple was actually growing bigger and bigger, and they actually had to hammer a nail into it to stop it from growing any further. How do you respond to that?
I mean, a temple like Big Temple will, it's only very natural that such stories come in place.
Right.
There is absolutely no records, anything like that. And hammering a deity with a nail, that a deity especially that's being worshipped, is a sin. Nobody will ever
Right.
do it.
Ah,
Yeah, I mean, if at all the Nandi grows as a miracle, well, it's a miracle and we worship him for that also. Even
Hmm.
without such a miracle happening, the Nandi there is worshipable and he is to be worshipped. There is absolutely no change in that. So, just in case to add a tag of miracle, such stories come in, and it's very normal for common public to just feel happy about it and go around propagating it too. So there is
True.
absolutely no record ever in the past about such a happening or hammering of the Nandi. It's again, I really appreciate the imagination of the person who came up with such a story. But such stories do keep going, and it has its own impact on people, and it adds a level of reverence to the Murti therein, which is still okay. Such stories are
Right.
really
Why not?
nice to listen to too, but when somebody brings it up in an academic platform to argue or establish a fact, that's where the problem comes in.
Right. There are so many more myths associated with this temple, and we'll talk about those too shortly. But before that, let's talk a little more about the structure itself and what an engineering marvel it is. They say the cupola on top of the Vimanam is a giant sphere weighing over 60 tons. How did they even manage to hoist it 200 feet above ground level and then place it so elegantly on top?
And related to that, there is all this talk about a 7 kilometer long ramp which was built to take this cupola to the top. Is that
Hmm.
really an accepted theory?
Okay, one of the most popular myths surrounding the big temple is about the monolithic hemispherical or spherical, stone there up at the Vimana. Uh,
Mhm.
for one thing, we've managed to go up during conservation activities and have actually seen it. It's not a monolith. It's not a single stone.
Right.
It's
oh,
not that it is 60 ton or 80 ton or 100 ton or 108 ton. And sometimes people even want to go for a 1008 ton, and without any clue about what a ton is actually. So
Hmm.
okay.
to begin with, it is certainly not a monolith. It's not a one single piece huge ball of stone there. It's
Mhm.
all segmental. The closest that I can go is to probably, for an understanding, the way it is all brought together is like how a Mozambique fruit is. You have several slices in it, all of which goes into segments in it, which goes into, in an appropriate way, in a very fashioned form, to
Hmm.
actually give the fruit a spherical
Round shape.
shape, a round shape there, to make it spherical. Similarly, we've had such segments of stones that were cut and taken all the way up to be positioned to actually give you that completed spherical shape to it. And then it is, of course, plastered, and lime plaster used for ornamentation and all that to mold
Hmm.
it into a perfect looking spear up there. Second part is about how it was taken up there. And the most popular story about a ramp for 3 or 5 or 7, or I don't know why it is always in odd numbers, but varying distances have been discussed also. A ramp which runs to so many kilometers, starting from a
Hmm.
place called Sarapallam, which is also there, an actual settlement which is like 3 or 4 kilometers from the big temple to the west of the big temple, or to the south, I'm not sure, but a ramp being built from there. Saram means a ramp actually, but a ramp of that scale, just imagine when you actually have to build a dome like that, a
Hmm.
pyramidal structure. At every level there would have been a requirement for a ramp. You don't, I mean, it's not that only the spherical dome, if at all we assume that to be one single piece of stone there, it's not that you need a ramp only to place that up. Every layer would have demanded a ramp too. How on
Correct.
earth did the granite block, which weighs close to whatever tons, lift it to the first floor level on the first hand, then the subsequent levels? There again, you will need ramps. In that case, you will need more ramps for all the four directions also. So, after a lot of discussions, I think the theory that which I really buy from the scholars is that as the structure was built, you have a foundation which is actually shallow. It's not even
Hmm.
large. Some say it's 3 feet, some say it's 5 feet, but not certainly more than that. So it's a shallow foundation that they have gone in for. A very traditional foundation, which what is called as random rubble, wherein you have random sized and shaped stone blocks being added to the foundation to
Hmm.
give the structure a kind of a soft bed on which it can actually rest. And when it is random unchiseled, it has its own friction also developed. So as they built, they also built a rammed earth circular ramp, a spiral ramp that goes around the structure,
Hmm.
thereby giving an access to the subsequent heights as they progressed vertically. Yeah, and physical access to the place also. If we consider that the elephants were used primarily to shift the stone blocks from wherever they were quarried all the way up to the big temple and to the subsequent levels vertically, the
Hmm.
elephants need proper ramp to pull the load up above, to carry it on them,
Correct.
right? In that case,
Mm.
rammed earth, raw earth rammed to give a kind of a spiral ramp look is the only possible solution to carry the load of an elephant on the first place.
Let's go back to another myth, a very popular myth. They say this tall temple does not cast any shadow at all.
I know, I've heard that one.
But surely that can't be true. So, how did such a myth originate?
uh, I mean, see, some of the myths associated with the temple seem to have been brought in during the 16th to 17th century when Puranas on the big temple was authored. But this not casting shadow part, I'm really not sure where it exactly started. And when you see something as grand as this, it is only again very common for public to come up with such stories.
Hmm.
And to be very frank, no structure can ever defy sciography. The casting of shadow is a very normal,
Law
a
of nature.
standard law of nature, exactly. So any object will have its own impact. I mean, it'll cast its own shadow at whatever length depending on the sun's position, and so does the Sri Vimana.
Hmm.
There is absolutely no doubt. It's actually a myth, and in several occasions I've seen people actually standing under the shade of the Vimanam and telling that it won't cast a shadow there in the big
Hmm.
temple. Yeah, that's how things
Uh, I've even heard a myth.
are.
I've even heard a myth about the myth, which is
Ah,
why did the myth come about? Because it is said that when they removed the spiral ramp,
uh-huh,
the mud ramp,
uh-huh.
Rajaraja is supposed to have asked the chief architect,
Hmm.
Perintachan, uh, will it really fall? And Perintachan is supposed to have said, no, my lord, even its shadow will not fall.
Oh my God. Okay. This is news to me and it sounds very dramatic too.
So
But
it
I'm
is a
happy
myth
the myth
about a
accommodates,
myth.
the mud ramp being built. I'm really happy that this myth accommodates the fact that a mud ramp was probably built. Great that way.
Continuing with the myths, there are so many more. I think my most favorite one is the myth that the main entrance is cursed and that politicians generally avoid entering the temple through that main entrance.
According to most historians, Rajaraja died a peaceful death aged about 67 years.
Hmm.
But myths are always more interesting than true history.
True.
According to one myth, Rajaraja committed suicide. Another myth is that he was lured to the top of the Vimana and then pushed to his death.
Hmm.
Now, to most historians, these are old wives' tales, but not
Hmm.
to modern day politicians. The prevailing superstition is that the temple is cursed and a political leader should not enter through the temple main entrance. If
Hmm.
he does, then disaster follows.
Right.
That's a good one.
So, and apparently it is also proven true in several cases. So there is a record for it. And people,
Uh-huh.
especially in power and position, wouldn't really want to take a chance. So they avoid it.
Well, yes, one prime minister who did so was actually shot. One
Hmm.
chief minister suffered a stroke, and one lost the next election. How bad can it get?
Right.
Here is a god that punishes the rulers but blesses the subjects. True people's god, huh?
All right, so moving on, they say that this temple has some secret chambers. Is that a myth too?
I think you're referring to the Sandara Arai. It is not such a secret chamber, really. It's a narrow
Mhm.
passage, about 6 or 7 feet wide, between the two walls of the Sanctum Sanctorum.
Yeah,
Hmm.
it's a bit like a second circumambulatory path, you know. So, in simple language, a circumambulatory path is just a passage that goes around the deity in the center. But
Hmm.
it is a very exciting space because apparently they've discovered murals over there that were actually done during Rajaraja's time. A
Hmm.
1,000-year-old murals. Quite a treasure trove, actually. And it was quite an accidental discovery, Madhu, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So the murals there, the paintings that were done on the walls, were replastered upon and painted on during the Vijayanagara and Nayaka periods. And so, I mean, they just wanted to probably renovate it and went for a painting that way. And
Hmm.
successively, you had the Nayaks, especially Shavapanayaka's time, there was a grand renovation of the temple campus too. So at that time, they have probably replastered the original canvases and painted on top of them,
Hmm.
but and it was forgotten. And as I told you, around the 1800s, the temple wasn't really very active due to various reasons.
Hmm.
So the this little space in between, the Sandara array, as it is called, the chamber there, was locked on both the sides, and it
Hmm.
was forgotten for good. And then we have this gentleman, a research scholar from Annamalai University, Chidambaram, Sri S.K. Govindaswamy Pillai,
Hmm.
who was researching upon Chola period paintings. So he had a hypothesis that if at all there are any remaining, they should be there in the big temple. So he
Hmm.
went in for a thorough search to hunt for these paintings in the big temple, and that's when he said to have noticed these little doors that were locked and rusted. So he got them opened and entered it, and just saw the place filled with cobwebs, and it's not been accessed at all. So he walked in through this narrow chamber, which would have probably looked very haunted during his times when he entered first, with a
Hmm.
lantern in his hand. And as he was looking through, he could only see the Vijayanagara period paintings. And when he turned, quite accidentally, the lantern hit the wall and scooped off a piece of lime plaster.
Hmm.
When that chunk fell down, he noticed faint pigments of color as a layer behind the existing paintings. So, probably the eureka moment of Sri S.K. Govindaswamy Pillai, he got
Right.
a few spaces scrapped off to reveal the Chola period paintings. Of course, even before the papers were completed and submitted, he died. So then we had to wait for several decades to come up with a scientifically approved methodology to ensure that the Vijayanagara period paintings, the Vijayanagara Nayak period paintings done there, are also not just scrapped off, because that's a part of the heritage too. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
they've done some immense scientific conservation method, extremely commendable, to ensure that these paintings are removed without disturbing. They get laminated, uh, they get stuck between two glass plates, and they are removed, thereby exposing the Chola murals. And the
Oh,
paintings
amazing.
Wow.
are a study by themselves. They are just grand. And the paintings are quite interesting too, because imagine in those days when there were only three small entrances to that space, they
Hmm.
cannot even use torch to light up the space, to illuminate the space, to actually paint, because
Hmm.
a lit torch would actually deposit some soot, and these canvases have to be wet. The lime plaster has got to be wet, because that's a part of the technique of painting those walls there. So the lime
Hmm.
plaster has got to be wet when the pigments are actually applied. So if you cannot afford, torch is lit to illuminate the space inside, and the space is very crisp too. To paint a canvas that is say 8 feet tall, you need some considerable space in between the canvas to go back and front, and to appreciate the painting, to understand as it grows, even for an artist, right?
Yeah, to
And
get the perspective. Yeah.
to get the perspectives right, exactly. So herein, all that is still a myth. The space is very, very crisp, and the it is ill-lit naturally. So we're not sure as to what was the kind of illumination that they used. Some say it would have probably been ghee made out of goat's milk, that
Hmm.
which burns, and it does not actually deposit soot. It does not generate soot. So these are some of the clues that we get from traditional artists and traditional practitioners. So in any, I mean, apply any parameter on it. these paintings just stand out of the usual murals that you see in in any temple in South India.
So
Yeah.
just to get that understood a little more clearly, Madhu, basically you have two levels of paintings, and both have been preserved intact.
Yep.
You have the
Yeah.
Chola paintings, and you have the later Nayak
Yes.
paintings.
Yes. Yes.
And I'm guessing it's not possible for the common man to go in and see them.
I mean, it is very, very delicate. It's extremely delicate, and the lighting and the temperature inside and all that has got to be controlled and
Controlled.
maintained.
Mm,
So
correct.
it becomes really challenging if it's opened out to everybody. But I would again like to commend the authorities there. They've come up with a brilliant plan during the thousandth year celebration. They've
Mhm.
set up a small museum, an extensively well done museum, brilliant exhibits, and both two special spaces inside the big temple. That's the Sandara Arai and a similar Arai space chamber in the first floor level, right atop it, where you have the Karana sculptures done. Both these
Mm.
spaces, which is not accessible to common public, they've gone in for life size models of both these things. You know, the paintings have been very, very technically crisply photographed, stitched together. They've got all of it with self-explanatory boards kept inside the museum too.
Oh,
And
that's
similarly, the sculptures on top, they've gone in for an acrylic casting, life-size casting of all the panels, the dance karanas panels,
mm,
and got
mhm.
them also exhibited with the corresponding names and the slokams, all of it along with. So it's very, very educative and one of the best done museums, site museums that you see here.
That's fantastic. Now let's talk about the inscriptions that you can see in the temple. I'm sure these have been studied in detail. What kind of interesting insights do we get from these inscriptions?
Sure. The inscriptions therein, the first inscription etched on the walls starts with Rajaraja's divine command of getting all the donations and the philanthropy etched on the stone walls as inscriptions. So he wants to make them as transparent records out there. And the best part is the first inscription speaks about how this idea striked upon him when he was actually having his bath, and
Hmm.
he immediately commissions the scribe, the royal scribe, and says, just go ahead, get all of these etched on walls. So the very dramatic lines, that which is very, very emotional to people who love Rajaraja and the big temple, it goes like this: நாம் கொடுத்தனவும் நம் அக்கன் கொடுத்தனவும் நம் பெண்டுகள் கொடுத்தனவும் மற்றும் கொடுத்தார் கொடுத்தனவும். Roughly translated, that means all that was donated by me, by my elder sister, that's Kundavai, and all my wives and all other people get all of these etched on the stone walls. Kallile vettuga. We just get them all engraved on the stone walls. So that's the
Hmm.
first inscription. From there, all the donations made by Rajaraja, his elder sister, and all the queens there, and other people like the ministers, the chief ministers, and the army commanders, the architect himself, and the Rajaguru of Rajaraja. So all their donations have been very, very clearly and have been etched on there. For example, the bronze murtis that were donated to the temple by all these different people have all been not just mentioned. It does not say
Hmm.
that Rajaraja, gave in a murti of Nataraja to be installed in the temple and worship. No, that's not the case. They have detailed it out to such great extent that if an artist wants to reproduce the murti, either as a painting or in bronze, he can actually do it.
Right. So now the Vimanam in this temple, which is the tower over the main Shiva shrine, is huge. It's way taller than the Gopuram or the entrance tower. But isn't it generally a norm for temples in these parts to have Gopurams which are taller than the Vimanam? Is this temple breaking a rule?
See, there is not a binding rule that the Gopuram has got to be taller than the Vimanam. While the architecture for a Vimanam is much easier because it actually rests on on like walls on all four sides, a Gopuram has got to be burrowed in. Yeah, wherein the engineering details are a bit complicated than a Vimanam. That way, till even the big temple, the time of construction of the big temple, the the technological advances when it comes to structural aspects was a bit limited. Nevertheless, Rajaraja tried something that was never done by anybody. So probably the Gopurams that he has built, both Keralantakan and Rajarajan Gopuram, the two Gopurams there as you walk in,
Mm.
were edifices during his own time. They were individually such great structural experiments that proved out to be successful during his time. Probably the tallest Gopuram during the times of the big temple. Nevertheless, the Agamas don't emphasize that the Vimanam has got to be shorter as opposed to the Gopuram. Neither do the Shilpa Shastras. As time passed, it became more like a thumb rule. The Vimanam, the height of the Vimanam is proportional to the size of the deity enshrined inside. While here in the big temple, depending on the size, the mammoth size of the Shivalingam inside, the Vimanam has got to be this huge.
A related question. Now, we are used to seeing Ganesha shrines at the entrance to most temples. But in this temple, the Ganesha shrine is not at the entrance. Why is that?
In fact, there is one more Ganesha shrine in this temple, which too is nowhere near the entrance.
Okay, this is a two-part question. There are several places identified inside a Shiva temple where the Agamas prescribe installation of a Ganesha sculpture or a Ganesha's shrine. He can be at the entrance. He can be very near the Dvajastambam. In fact, the pedestal of the Dvajastambam, you can give him a small shrine. He
Right.
can occupy the left side of all the entrances too, what we call as the Dwara Ganapati. But
Mhm.
all that being said, the presiding Ganapati for the temple, what we call as the Kshetra Ganapati, that Ganapati for that shrine should
Hmm.
occupy the southwest corner, which is
Uh-huh.
pretty much appropriately positioned in the big temple. Part two, the Ganesha shrine that we see today, as we just discussed, is a Maratha period addition. He was brought in during the Maratha period, while the
Hmm.
Ganesha actually built by Rajaraja is there in the cloistered circumambulatory path right behind the Maratha Ganesha. One can also see a Chola period Ganesha at the main entrance to the Mahamandapa. After you cross the Nandi Mandapam, you have a
Hmm.
fleet of stairs that you climb up, and there is this small porch like structure where Chola period Kshetrabala, Durga will all be housed. So, there
Hmm.
again to your left, you can see a huge Ganesha enshrined there. Another Chola period Ganesha, which was brought in much later and added there as a Dwara Ganapati. So, how many ever Ganeshas you have anywhere else in the temple? The one in the southwest is the most prominent,
Hmm.
and the Kshetra
Most
Ganapati.
important.
So, he's pretty much appropriately positioned there in the big temple.
Great. That brings me to my last question. If you had to pick three of your most favorite things about the big temple, what would those be?
Okay. To me, I think the paintings in the Sandara array, that's my
Mhm.
most favorite aspect of the temple. The
Hmm.
second is Rajaraja is believed to have donated so many murtis of Shiva in different forms, Nataraja, Bhikshatana, Dakshinamurti, Lingodbhava, and all that. And while we have
Hmm.
lost all of them, the most grand and dramatic Natarajas of the Cholas, one of the most grand Natarajas ever done during Chola period, gifted by Rajaraja to this temple,
Hmm.
poetically referred to as Dakshina Meru Vidangar, is still housed there in the temple. That which occupies the shrine of Nataraja, both Nataraja and Shivakami, gifted during Rajaraja's time, is fortunately safeguarded and he's still there. That's my second most interesting aspect of the temple. Third is the Nandi that was installed during Rajaraja's time, the Nandi which was uprooted during Shivapanaika's renovation of the big temple, and that which is kept there in the southern corridor of the temple. He's still there facing north, seated quietly. And to me personally, more than even the Brihadeeswara Lingam inside, this Nandi, the royal attendant, the very proud servant of Shiva, who's stood witness to a good 1,000 years of history, he captures my attention much more than Shiva himself inside. So these are
Hmm.
like
But
three of my most. In fact, the grand architecture and engineering and all that takes a backseat when it comes to such emotionally charging icons there.
Right. So the paintings in the Sandara array, or their recreations that you can view in the site museum, the Nataraja idol from the Chola period, and the Nandi idol also from the Chola period. So if you're visiting the Brihadishwara temple, make sure you do not miss these sites. On that note, we end today's podcast. Thank you, Akila and Kaushik, and thank you so much, Madhu. That was absolutely insightful. Thank you for joining us on this podcast.
My pleasure, totally, and I really enjoyed recollecting and talking about a place that is so special to me. I'm really fond of, and yeah, this is one example of a grand temple. I should tell you a minor portion of what we discussed today is what has gone into construction and maintenance of thousands of temples around Tamil Nadu. That's how
Right.
special these temples here in South India especially are. And I take this opportunity to bow before the brilliance of all these kings, starting from the kings, of course, the patrons, to the architects, the designers, the civil engineers, the structural engineers, the several lakhs of priests who have served the big temple, and Rajaraji Choramudaya Paramaswamy, as the deity there is referred to in the inscriptions of Rajaraja's time. So I take this opportunity to thank and bow before all those several lakhs and crores of servants, starting from the temple barber to the Devadasis who have performed there, to the priests and the service attendants, the cooks and the musicians, and just everybody to keep a system live for almost a millennium, a little more than a millennium, in fact, now. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
How did you like this episode? Do subscribe to the Storytrails podcast and consider supporting us on Patreon. We have many more stories to tell, and you will find them in our short video series, blog, and audio tours. Links on our website www.storytrails.in. We'll meet you in the next episode with yet another exciting story.